So, preliminarily, what are you reading these days?
I just started reading Walter Scott's first novel, Waverly, last night, which is it's very interesting.
I don't think I've ever read any Walter Scott.
Well, he's most famous for writing Ivanhoe, but he wrote this. His first novel, Waverly, is widely considered to be the first novel of historical fiction. Scott's period of writing sort of neatly fits in between the end of Jane Austen and the beginning of Anthony Trollope.
So the middle
So
19th century
Well, this
or
novel is from
earlier?
1814, which is just before Jane Austen's death. And Trollope, what year did Trollope start writing? I guess in the
I
late
think in the middle.
1840s.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the middle
so
19th.
so it pretty much covers that period. When Waverly came out, it's about a young English aristocrat who joins the Bonnie Prince Charlie rebellion in 1745, which is the attempt to place the Stuarts back on the throne in preference to the German Hanoverians who'd been brought over because they were Protestant and the Stuarts were Catholic. It was a huge hit, and it had been published anonymously, and everyone in London spent years trying to guess who it was before Scott finally admitted it had been him. Though Byron
Was
gave
there some
away.
sort of stigma associated with that?
Well, no, but Scott was a pretty well-known poet at the time, and I think he didn't, in case it was a flop, he didn't want it to affect his reputation. And but it became just sort of a fun thing for him to be the only one who really knew who it was. But Byron outed him. I like
What a
Byron's
jerk.
poetry, but yeah, Byron was a huge jerk. He was a bit of a joke too in some ways. He was a very ridiculous figure at times in his life. But he alleged in an interview, someone asked him in an interview, so who do you think is who wrote Waverly? And he said, "Oh, well, Walter Scott pretty much told me it was him. I was walking down the street with him, and I said, the problem with Waverly is that the guy who wrote it didn't think there were going to be so many sequels." And Scott said, "Yeah, well, when I got to work on it, I didn't think it would be that popular." And then caught himself. And then Scott says in a foreword he wrote to the third edition, which I read, and which is very funny. Scott is an extremely funny writer, uh, sort of Tom Jonesy in his
Tom
sort
Jones
of.
is one of my favorite novels, so
Yeah,
if it's
but
in that,
it's sort of like it's Tom Jones, but it's written 60, 70 years later. Uh, and so it has a much more modern feel to it. But anyways, Scott said that he never had that conversation with Byron and is pretty sure he would remember if he did. And he thinks Byron just made it up because he was pretty sure Scott had written Waverly and was a bit of a troublemaker. But
I can see Byron doing that.
yeah. Yeah, by the way, have you read anything? Do you read?
Yes, I do. I have been reading Chaucer actually, and the reason I'm reading Chaucer is because I was on an airplane that was delayed 4 hours on the tarmac in New York, and in those circumstances when it was really late at night, I was really eager to get home, and it's just hard to sit in one place, not worry because you want information, and every moment you hope the plane will just go and take off. And in times like that, when I can't really think about anything and I can't focus on a book, I find that reading poetry is very helpful. And to an extent, Chaucer is one of the best of all because you can figure out what's going on in Middle English. Actually, if you're tuned into it, it's much easier to understand than Old English. Old English would be Beowulf, which begins Wat when Yardanen Yardium Theod Kunninga Thrum Yafrunan Hu the Athalingas Ellen Fremadon. It's impossible essentially to parse what that is unless you're a scholar
It's.
expert.
I will just mention that for work, I was reading the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is written in Old English oh, about 200 years after Beowulf. And some of it is like that. It's completely incomprehensible. And then every now and then you'll come across a sentence that uses only Old English words that survived to modern English, and it'll be pretty much perfectly clear,
Yeah, so
which
I,
is
for
very
example,
interesting.
for example, in that prologue of Beowulf, it begins with a description of this fellow who became king, and it ends with saying that was good cunning, that is good kinging, and so you
Yep.
can actually figure out what that means. But when you fast forward to Chaucer, it has really a wonderful rhythmic sound. There's a lot more German pronunciation in the language, but also a lot of words that are directly from French, and they haven't they haven't shrugged off their origins, so they're still pronounced more or less as they would have been in the donor languages at that point. And it's actually, I just find it very relaxing to go through. So, the beginning of the prologue, which is, when that April with his shoulders solta, the drocht of March hath perced the rota, and bathed every vein, and switched the cur of which vertu engendered is the floor. And I found that it did get my mind off the flight very substantially. So I continued to read it when I got home. And I do every once in a while. I used to read Chaucer or other poetry either when I was commuting on the subway or when I was taking a walk. And I find that once you read it through a few times, you can get good parts of it in your memory, and that is also very. It's very rewarding to be able to just sit around when you have a couple of seconds, and rather than pick up your phone, you pick up your brain and look in your memory for something worthwhile. And poetry is an interesting category. I think we should talk more about it in general, because poetry is the only one of the arts that you can perform or make, either one, entirely inside your own mind. You don't need any external instruments to play it on. You don't need materials like paint brushes or pens. You can just think it, and you can hear the words in your head, or you can say them out loud, but it's an entirely, you-powered operation. A single person's mind can encompass all of poetry. And I think that's a very interesting category for an artwork. Anyway, we should turn to the subject at hand.
Obviously no space podcast is complete without some recitation of Beowulf and Chaucer.
Wish
I knew who wrote Beowulf, by the way.
This is probably
the author
Mr.
is lost.
Wolf.
Part of the manuscript for Beowulf was discovered, I think, in a library in like the 18th century, the 17th century, and it was discovered after there had been a fire in the library, and some of the original pages were burned as it was thrown out of the burning library onto the grass outside. So some of the pages of the principal copy of Beowulf were actually lost very recently, in relative terms, 1,000 years after it was written, 300 years before now, which really sucks. I hate when that happens.
So do I, but I don't love Beowulf, so I can get along without.
I didn't love Beowulf either, but then I actually listened to a new translation a couple of years ago by the same guy who had done a new translation I really liked of the Iliad. And I thought it was great and completely changed my views of Beowulf. You should listen to it. Because I know you listened to that Iliad too when I told you how much I liked it, and you really liked it also.
That recording of the Iliad got me through a very lengthy and annoying illness.
Me too. I mean, that's why we were both listening to it. Because I don't normally listen to audiobooks.
I was actually, it's about as sick as I've ever been. I was almost. What do you call it when you're practically unconscious? It was a really bad fever, and that's.
Anyway,
let's turn to the subject in hand, which is we're going to discuss the second half, or rather the top half of what you think the top 10 space missions of all time was. And again, your list contains several notable errors or omissions, but let's go by your list. And have we discussed Gemini 6 and 7 yet?
Oh yeah, we did Gemini 6 and 7 last time.
So then Gemini 3 is
well, actually,
next up.
I want to swap Apollo 10 and Gemini 3, because I think Gemini 3 was really a top 3 mission, and Gemini 10 is a top 4 mission. Also, something I forgot last time in the first episode of this that I really need to revise is Bob Gilruth. I talked about the 4 men at the top of NASA who made all the decisions as being Jim Webb, Deke Slayton, Chris Kraft, and George Low. And that was wrong. Jim Webb was the director of NASA. When I talked about Jim Webb, I was thinking of Bob Gilruth, who is the man on the ground. He was in charge of NASA in Houston. He wasn't the political appointee. He was the senior scientist, engineer, manager of NASA. And it just, I wanted to correct that, just because he was a brilliant man who was responsible for huge portions of the space program coming off. He was the man, Kennedy told Jim Webb to get us to the moon by the end of the 60s, and then Jim Webb told Bob Gilruth, and Bob Gilruth, put together the team of Chris Kraft and Deke and George Low, and he was the top man on everything, holding everything together, and I just wanted to mention that I'd left him out in an
Consider the record corrected.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, Apollo 10. Apollo 10 was the dress rehearsal for Apollo 11. There was serious talk about just going to the moon and landing on Apollo 10. But the mass concentrations of the moon had not been fully mapped during Apollo 8.
And before, all right, so just to yes, the brief chronology is Apollo 8 orbited the moon,
Right.
and that's the
Then
first time
Apollo
we did that.
9 was an Earth orbital test of the LEM. And so Apollo 8 confirmed we could orbit the moon. Apollo 9 confirmed that the LEM worked. So in theory, Apollo 10 could have just landed on the moon, but they wanted to practice LEM flying in lunar orbit a little more before they actually landed. All of this stuff was done on such an unbelievably short timescale because everything was so thoroughly simulated before all these flights that basically all of the Apollo flights went perfectly except for 13. And there were going to be a lot more tests of all of these missions before the next stage of the program was advanced. That is, Earth orbital flights and lunar orbital flights, LEM flights, landings. But they all went so perfectly that basically each stage only had one test flight, which is just a remarkable testament to both the quality of the engineering and the quality of the pre-flight training and simulation they did, simulating every possible outcome. And so Apollo 10 was Tom Stafford commanding. John Young was the command module pilot, who was also the right-hand seater on Gemini 3 we'll get to. And Gene Cernan, who would go on to command Apollo 17, be the last man on the moon, was the lunar module pilot. It was the first time a space flight had ever taken place where everyone on the flight had been in space already. It was the most experienced crew to ever fly for decades after this happened, until the space shuttle era, and then there were more men aboard, more astronauts aboard. It was a very good crew, and that's why there was serious talk about it being the moon landing. But the moon is got weird mass concentrations near its surface because it has a very anemic core. It doesn't have a lot of iron in its core, so it's kind of all over the place gravity-wise. And they didn't want the landing to, find itself suddenly in higher gravity or lower gravity than it was expecting. So they did sort of a test flight down to within, I think, about 9 miles of the lunar surface. So very, very close.
In the LEM or in the command module?
In the LEM. So
All right,
they
so they
detached
actually
the LEM
were
from the command module and flew it down just above the surface of the moon. There's a famous quote from Gene Cernan, "We are down among them," because they were at the height of the tops of not quite at the height of the peaks of the mountains on the moon, but yeah, that's what it felt like to him because they were getting so close to the surface.
It must have been quite frustrating to get so close to the moon and not be on. I mean, every command module pilot experienced this, of course, because he had to remain behind while the two guys got into the LEM and went down to the surface of the moon. But to actually be in the LEM, designed for landing on the moon, and not be allowed to land is...
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I like Gene Cernan so much is because, unlike some of the other guys, he stuck around to get his chance to walk on the moon. A lot of the other guys retired, but he ended up commanding Apollo 17 because Apollo 10 was not enough for him.
You've referred to this before, that several men had the opportunity to walk on the moon and turned it down, which I find absolutely astonishing. But I mean, especially because they were already in the program, and you think that that sort of would have been walking on the moon would have been the epitome of what they were trying to achieve. And so although I recognize the mental pressures must have been extraordinary, the physical pressures extraordinary, still I can't quite put myself into the frame of mind of a man who would be offered a chance to walk on the moon, already be an astronaut, already be in the space program, and turn it down.
Yeah, I talked about this with Chris Kraft. And by the way, it's hilarious to me the number of comments we've gotten on this discussion on like Instagram. It's like, oh, it's AI generated answers, or what are your sources? My sources are primary sources, are the original people who made these decisions and talked to the astronauts with them. I talked to Chris Kraft about this specifically, because he was. I mean, Deke Slayton is dead. I wish I could have talked about it with Deke, but Chris Kraft was involved in these decisions of astronaut choices. And he completely understood Frank Borman, who was the commander of Apollo 8, not wanting to command Apollo 11. Frank Borman could have been the first man on the moon, but chose not to because he wanted to retire. And Chris Kraft understood that. Apollo 8 had been extremely dangerous. It was a huge stress to him and his family. He got unbelievably sick on Apollo 8. We'll cover that when we get to Apollo 8. And he had had enough. And Mike Collins, who is the command module pilot for Apollo 11, could also have walked on the moon. He was offered command of Apollo 17. The only astronaut who retired early, who Chris Kraft sounded a little, I don't want to say he sounded bitter about it, but annoyed, was Jim McDivitt, who had been the commander of Apollo 9. Jim McDivitt was regarded by everyone as just a top flight astronaut, one of the very best. And he could have had his own moon mission if he'd stuck around. But after Apollo 9, he retired. He commanded Gemini 4. He retired to go work for like an electronics company, and Chris Kraft had just found that impossible to understand. He hadn't done his moon flight. He'd worked so hard for so long to build the moon program and then just kind of left without doing it. And Jim McDivitt is also, he's the only astronaut in the so-called New 9 group, which is the second group of astronauts after the original Mercury 7, who hasn't written a memoir. And people have been after him to write his memoir for years. And it's sort of in the space journalism community, which I sort of dipped my toe into when I was still writing for magazines about 10 years ago. There's a lot of frustration with Jim McDivitt for refusing to write his memoirs. He just likes to, play golf. And
What would you say is the best of the New 9 memoirs that you've read?
Well, I think I said this on the first podcast. The best space memoir by far is Carrying the Fire, which was Mike Collins, who was from the third group of astronauts, Group 3. And
was a command module pilot on Apollo 11.
On Apollo 11, right. Which of the New 9 ones are the best? John Young's is very good. John Young, who was on Apollo 10 and then Apollo 16. He commanded Apollo 16. So he got to walk on the moon too. His memoir is called Forever Young. Jim Lovell's book about Apollo 13, it's a memoir, but it's mainly about Apollo 13, is absolutely fascinating. And he talks about things that are sort of, if you've seen the movie, you know a lot of the story, but he talks about it in a lot more detail. And some of the things like the time the lights went out in his jet when he was going in for a carrier landing, which is interesting. It's not explained in the movie, but they went out because Jim Lovell was a superb engineer. He didn't, I guess, have the best eyesight, so he built himself a dome light for his jet himself and didn't tell anyone, and just wired it into the dashboard, which it turns out is not a great idea to just wire things into your fighter jet, your carrier jet, without telling anyone. So he was the reason all the lights shorted out in the cockpit, because he had wired something himself and over stressed a breaker or something, which is kind of funny. But
so I suppose then, so you've read Jim Lovell's book, and you can say that Apollo 13, the movie, hews closely to reality.
Very, very closely. The other member of the New 9 who didn't write a memoir is Neil, but that's Neil Armstrong, but that's a slightly different case. A lot of books have been written about him, and he's participated in them, but he's always been very careful not to show off. He is, and so that's considered a different case from Jim McDivitt.
A man with a preternaturally low heart rate.
Yes, and it's amusing. It's something that I've always really liked, is that there was great variation in the amount of exercise the astronauts got. There was no mandatory physical training of any sort, and certain astronauts were extremely fit. Like John Glenn was the famous example. He was always up just running laps every morning, annoying everyone by how peppy he was. And Neil was at the absolute other end of the scale. Neil once said to Mike Collins, and Collins talks about this in his memoir, Carrying the Fire. And by the way, I don't know if you can see me pointing off to the left. It's because Carrying the Fire happens to be like right next to my shoulder here. But
can't see it. Take your word.
Doesn't matter. Neil said to Mike once when Mike asked him why he never got any exercise, he says, you only have a certain number of heartbeats in your life, and I don't intend to waste any on exercise. So,
well, when he was piloting the LEM simulator and ejected from it,
we're going to discuss all this for Apollo 11.
But
that was training for Apollo 11. We should save that for Apollo 11.
As long as we're here though with Neil Armstrong, is it correct that his heart rate didn't fluctuate more than a few beats per minute when he was? No,
that's actually not true. He was unbelievably calm in appearance, but actually because NASA was tracking his heart, they weren't tracking it during the Spider, the flying bed frame. It was called the LEM simulator.
The LEM simulator.
But during Apollo 11, they were tracking his heart rate, and it got up to like 150 or something. But he never showed it. He was visibly extremely calm and kept everyone very calm around him. And there were some slight problems on Apollo 11 that Neil handled with remarkable calm. But he himself may have been, very worried, but he never let anyone know he was worried, which is really the ideal commander.
You're right. We'll get back to Apollo 11. So let's talk
about Apollo 10. So Tom Stafford also wrote a book, very good. Uh, Apollo 10 was the perfect dress rehearsal. Everything went perfectly except for one kind of funny mistake. I mean, very not funny at the time because it was almost catastrophic, but sort of funny in how it happened. And subsequently, when they were testing the LEM, they ascended out of the low altitude lunar flight back up to rendezvous with the command module, and they did this at the Sea of Tranquility. So they were testing the exact trajectory that Neil would fly on Apollo 11, and there was an automatic radar adjuster in the cockpit which they had to switch off, and both pilots, that is Tom Stafford, who was the commander on the left, and Gene Cernan, who was the lunar module pilot on the right, both flipped it off. So when it's not clear who did it first, but they both thought it was their job on the checklist, so they flipped it off and then flipped it on again. And then the LEM started to tumble completely out of control. And for like half a minute, it was just tumbling through space because it was completely confused about what it was supposed to be aiming its radar at. And this became a minor scandal because Gene Cernan was a sailor and began swearing profusely on a live radio circuit. But he figured out pretty quickly, or Stafford figured out what had happened. They flipped it off again, and then everything was fine. But aside from that, everything went really well. There was a very strange debate that has never been fully resolved about the color of the moon, because Apollo 8 reported that it was very gray and sort of like plaster of Paris. And Apollo
Certainly
10,
the way it appears in pictures.
Yeah, Apollo 10, all of the astronauts agreed that it was more brown than gray. And no one has ever been able to satisfactorily explain this discrepancy. The astronauts themselves, the 6 of them, have argued about this many times. And all of the subsequent flights agreed with Apollo 8. So it was at the angle of the sun was different. It's not really clear.
It's not possible that they had something different built into the glass of the windows that would have given it a
that was
tinting
my
effect.
first guess, actually. But I don't see how that could be. I mean, obviously every command module was a custom
Unique.
job.
Yeah, so
it's not
I
like
mean,
there
that,
was
that
really
would
an
still be the
assembly
most
line.
logical explanation if the glass itself was just very slightly yellow.
Yeah, but the photographs of the Earth don't show that. I mean, the colors are the same as the photographs of the Earth from Apollo 8.
It's curious.
Anyways, it doesn't really matter. It's just one of those minor moon mission mysteries that no one has ever been able to satisfactorily explain. But really, flying the LEM down towards the surface of the moon without knowing what the mass situation near the surface of the moon was. I mean, the first men ever to take a LEM down towards the moon, to take a spaceship like this down towards any celestial body that wasn't the Earth, was a completely new experience. And the fact that it went off so perfectly and the men were so well trained, and the fact that they really took their lumps, because they had thought for a long time that they were going to make the first moon landing. None of them ever complained. They didn't resign in a huff. They didn't make a big deal about it. Tom Stafford never got to walk on the moon. They just did their job. They did it perfectly. It's sort of like, the Betty Grissom scene in The Right Stuff. She didn't get to meet Jackie Kennedy. They didn't get the big ticker tape parade. No one remembers Apollo 10. The Apollo 8 guys were Men of the Year on the cover of Time magazine. I'm sure the Apollo 11 guys were too, though I'm not actually sure. I assume they were. Those 6 men, Apollo 8 and Apollo 11, were all huge celebrities. Apollo 10 did a mission that was essentially as dangerous, in certain senses more dangerous, because of the separation of the LEM and the descent towards the surface of the moon, and didn't become celebrities. No one knows who they are. And in Tom Stafford's case, he didn't even get to walk on the moon. But
all right, so give us their names again. The crew of Apollo 10.
Tom Stafford, who is going to make the flight on Gemini 3, by the way, which is the next mission, but was bumped for 2 reasons. One, he was Al Shepard's right-hand man. That is, he was going to be the co-pilot for Al Shepard, and Al Shepard was bumped from the flight rotation because he had an inner ear problem and didn't fly again until Apollo 14, and he got to walk on the moon too. And the other reason was because it turned out he was too tall for the Gemini capsule. And I can't understand how this oversight got so late in the program, but when they tried to close the capsule on his head wearing a helmet, it scrunched him down into his seat in a way he couldn't really move. But he was such a good astronaut, they decided to build what was called the Stafford bubble. So sort of like if you look at a Dodge Viper, it's got roof bubbles for the driver's helmet. So they built a door like that for him so he could fly Gemini missions. But that caused a little delay. Anyways, so Tom Stafford was the commander. John Young, who replaced him on Gemini 3 and who commanded Gemini 10, was the command module pilot. So he was the first man ever to orbit the moon by himself in the command module, while Stafford and Gene Cernan was the third man, the LEM module pilot, descended towards the surface of the moon. John Young commanded Apollo 16. Gene Cernan commanded Apollo 17. They both ended up walking on the moon, which they deserved to do. It was an exceptional
Who was the
mission.
command module pilot?
John Young.
On John Young. And so who was the third man on this mission?
Eugene Cernan.
Gene Cernan.
And we talked about him on Apollo 17, which is, I think, the perfect moon landing mission. But
And the last.
But Apollo 10 is just one of those. It was only the second flight to the moon. It was the first descent towards the surface of the moon. It was doing things no one had ever done before. It was remarkably dangerous.
I bet
Just
they got some
pure
good pictures. So there are 17 Apollo missions. There are 7 Mercury missions.
I think there was
there weren't 17
no...
because there was no Apollo. I mean, Apollo 1 you can count as a mission, but of course ended on the launch pad. There was no Apollo 2, 3, 4. What was the first Apollo that actually
Apollo
flew?
4 and Apollo 6 were the first 2 tests of the Saturn V, I think. And Apollo 4 got the first photograph of the Earth as most of a sphere, where you could see the spherical curvature of the Earth. I think 3 and 5 were tests of the escape rockets and the capsule systems, but not in orbit, just sort of in ballistic flight. And so they got numbers, but they weren't actual missions. And then Apollo 7 was the first actual flight.
How many Gemini missions were there?
12. Gemini 12 was the last one. That was Buzz Aldrin's first flight. If he hadn't made that, he wouldn't have been able to go to the moon. Just because they wanted experienced men to make the first moon landing.
Well, that's fair.
And and Buzz, I don't remember. Buzz sort of got shifted into that at the last moment. It's interesting that Mike Collins was going to be on Apollo 8, but got bumped because he had spine problems from an ejection years earlier when he'd been a test pilot at Edwards. And just suddenly, like a vertebrae disc snapped and he had to have surgery on it. So he was replaced with Jim Lovell. So Mike Collins missed his chance to walk on the moon on Apollo 11. He missed his chance to make the first moon flight on Apollo 8. But he also missed commanding Apollo 13, which he would have done if Lovell hadn't replaced him on Apollo 8. So, small world.
All right, so that's your choice for fourth greatest space mission or fourth most important space mission of all time, Apollo 10. So do you want to move to the top 3 now?
Yes, the top 3, beginning with Gemini 3. And Gemini 3 is the basis for everything else that happened in space, and also every space movie you've ever seen with people flying around in space, because up until Gemini 3, every space mission flown by both the Americans and the Russians had been a trajectory determined at launch. It was, a bullet fired from the gun. And though you could, or maybe a better analogy is sitting on a desk chair, you push off and you roll across the room. Now you can sort of twist yourself around on the desk chair. That would be changing your attitude in space, which astronauts could do from the first missions. The Americans, the Russians didn't do that until later on. But you can't change the direction the chair is moving, except by stopping it, which is like the retrorockets firing to re-enter. You can put your feet down. But if you want to change the direction without stopping the chair and, you use a fire extinguisher or something, it's obviously, you can intuitively tell it's very, very hard to control. But that's basically what Gemini 3 did. It was the first mission to change orbits in space. It proved that spaceflight could actually be done rather than just firing a bullet into space. You could fly an actual vehicle that could adjust itself and maneuver in space. All of that started with Gemini 3 when Gus Grissom took the hand controller, the joystick that sat between the 2 men in the Gemini capsule, and manually flew the capsule into a new orbit.
Who was the other man?
That was John Young. who was on
So
Apollo 10.
John Young and Gus Grissom. And when you say they flew into a new orbit, were they changing the orbit's line relative to the Earth, or were they
No,
in a higher
they
or
were
lower
changing
orbit?
the shape of the orbit it had a new perigee and a new apogee. It was a different shape. It was more egg-shaped and got up to a higher altitude. And this was the basis then for allowing rendezvous in orbit, because you have to have converging orbits for rendezvous, obviously. And to rejoin the LEM to the command module coming back from the moon. All of that was made possible by Gemini 3. And you can just, if you think about how hard it would be to try to navigate yourself around an office on a rolling desk chair using a fire extinguisher, you can understand what a monumental engineering challenge this was. And also just the fact that Gus was such an incredible pilot that he did this by hand. And I always feel compelled to defend Gus Grissom, because I hate that almost everyone knows him from The Right Stuff, which is
That is the movie, not the
an awful
books.
movie. Yeah.
The book treated him fine. It's the movie that had this shameful. I mean, I think they just decided
Shameful
for
and
the sake of the movie.
completely fictional image of him panicking and accidentally sinking his own Mercury capsule. Oh, he named Gemini 3, by the way, Molly Brown, the unsinkable
The
Molly
unsinkable
Brown.
Molly Brown
Yeah.
is a
NASA
tongue-in-cheek.
did not like this and told him to change it. And he said if they didn't let him call it Molly Brown, he was going to call it Titanic. And so they let him keep the name.
Great
Gus was
pilot.
very amusing. I'm always sorry that Gus doesn't get enough credit. When they were preparing the Gemini 3 capsule, I think John Young mentions this in his book, Forever Young. Because he and Gus were very close, obviously. That they did a tour of the Gemini plant where the capsules were being built, and they asked Gus to make a speech to inspire the workers. And Gus went up to the microphone and said, "Do good work." And that was the whole speech. He didn't really like speaking in public. And everyone just went crazy. They were cheering, applauding. They painted it on the walls of the building on the inside
whole
and the
speech.
outside. Yeah, the whole speech, the entire text of the speech.
I can't help but feel that the reason The Right Stuff, the movie, tarnished Gus's reputation that way was simply because he was dead and was not around to defend himself, which is the worst of all when you think about it. He had been killed in the Apollo 1 fire, and so there was no one to defend his reputation, or at least he wasn't around to defend his reputation.
Yes, which is really disgraceful. And, there's a reason he made the second Mercury flight and the first Gemini flight and was going to make the first Apollo flight. It's because he and Alan Shepard were the best pilots in the program. And generally, the consensus was that the best pilots in the program were Al Shepard, Gus Grissom, and Deke Slayton. Deke got bumped because of his heart problem, and John Glenn was next on that list. I mean, they were all very good pilots. I'm not denigrating their pilot status. At least I would until we get to Scott Carpenter. Their pilotry?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I don't want to denigrate their pilotry, but that's in terms of their being calm and collected and competent. Gus, there was a reason that Gus was at the head of all these lists. It's because he was really, really good. And then the idea in the movie that he panicked and sank his own Mercury.
Hey, what do you have
capsule
to
was
say about
just
Scott
asinine.
Carpenter? Wasn't he? That was Scott Crossfield, who was the first man to go twice the speed of sound. I
Yeah,
think.
it's funny. I talked to Chris Craft about Scott Crossfield too, but some of that stuff is off the record. Maybe I shouldn't even have said that. They had an argument. I mean, Scott Crossfield was a great pilot. This wasn't off the record. Scott Crossfield and Frank Borman had an argument about I think it was the second stage of the Saturn V. Scott Crossfield flew rocket planes. He didn't, for whatever reason, he didn't become an astronaut. I don't know. Maybe he was too tall or too short or didn't want to. Maybe he didn't have a college degree, which is the reason Chuck Yeager was never recruited to be an astronaut. In any event, they had a big argument, he and Frank Borman, who was an astronaut, but they were also both rocket pilots at Edwards. And Chris Craft did something, well, I take Frank Borman's opinion over Scott Crossfield's, every day of the week and twice on Sunday or something like that. But I don't, he may have been joking. It was just a momentary thing in a very long conversation. Anyway, so Scott Crossfield was a great pilot. Though he died pretty recently. He was still flying planes at like 95 and he crashed. So that may not
That's
have been
I'm sure that's the way a test pilot would want to go.
would want to go out. Yeah.
Yes,
I
exactly.
imagine so.
At the age of 95, but in your airplane.
Yeah.
So that's
Gemini 3. Gemini 3. So it was. I mean, that was the center point of the mission, but it was also the first flight of a brand new capsule. The first Gemini flight. on a new rocket. The Titan rocket is the first time it had carried men into space. So it
Wait,
was
Gemini 3 was the first flight of a Gemini capsule?
Gemini 3 was the first test flight of Gemini. It was the first flight. It was the first Gemini flight.
So what's 1 and 2?
1 and 2 were unmanned tests.
All right, so the first time guys had been in a Gemini capsule.
Yeah,
Gemini
and it
3
was
is
it was very risky. If you've ever looked at launches of Gemini, you will have noticed that unlike Mercury and Apollo, there isn't a little rocket tower on the top of the capsule.
There's
That's
no
because,
abort tower. I mean,
right.
Escape
That's
rocket.
because they had a very bad idea during Gemini development.
Oh wait, wasn't there ejector seats?
There were ejector seats, yes. And John Young mentions this in his memoir, and so does Mike Collins, that the test dummies kept coming back decapitated. And so they had the ejector seats worked sometimes, but enough test dummies were decapitated that when Gemini 7, I think it was, almost tipped during launch, Wally Schirra was the commander. He had his hands on the ejection D-ring. And I think in Chris Pratt books, he mentions that he hugged Wally afterwards for not having pulled the ejector lever because he was so close to mission rules to eject, and it might have killed him because the ejector seats just didn't work well. I think it's the only thing in the entire 60s space program that was just objectively dangerous but was let go.
Well, they had tried to...
In a way that kind of leads into the Apollo 1 fire.
They tried a bunch of interesting novel ideas with Gemini, including there had been a plan to, instead of having it land in the water by parachutes, they wanted to have a paraglider version of it that would actually fly down under a semi-controlled flight, or I guess controlled flight.
Yeah, so it was completely controlled flight. It was going to be just like a hang glider.
A hang glider with
pop out of the capsule instead of parachutes, and it would land conventionally on a runway.
And actually, you can see one of these in the Udvar Hazy Center in Washington D.C. in the Air and Space Annex. They have one of the glider versions of the Gemini capsules.
Yeah, and I seem to recall reading about Gus and Jim McDivitt. I think it was Jim McDivitt flying these in tests, like not actual Gemini capsules, but Gemini mock-ups.
I wonder why they didn't end up using it.
It was too risky. The splashdowns were a lot safer. You know, they didn't want, because a couple times parachutes didn't open. They had redundant parachutes, but you couldn't really have redundant wings, and they didn't want them to break off during landing.
I suppose so. Still, interesting idea. And you know, I think that we're inclined to think that the final solutions that we came up for with all of this technology was sort of the way it was bound to be. But things could have taken a very different course in so many ways.
Yeah.
I mean,
just like with the Air Force ruining the space shuttle. The space shuttle would not have needed solid rocket boosters if the Air Force had not insisted on making the wings much, much larger and much, much, much heavier so that it could do aborts to smaller conventional airports instead of specific, space shuttle design landing spots. It just made it so heavy that it made it completely useless and ruined the space shuttle completely. And the Air Force never used it at all. This was because they had big plans for the space shuttle, which they also did for the Gemini capsule, but they never got that up.
Military procurement is replete with such stories, of course. Yeah. And the story of the design of the M16 is another one such, because it was supposed to be a universal rifle that all the services would use identically, including the Navy. You wonder why they would need the same requirements for a good rifle for the Marine Corps and the Army would also apply to the Navy, but they thought that they would, and then they didn't end up even doing that, which is why if you find early versions of the M16 that were made for the Navy, you'll find they don't have a forward assist. Not a lot of people know that.
Yeah, but the funny thing, first of all, the funny thing is that we made all of the NATO countries adopt 30 caliber rifles and then instantly gave up on them ourselves. And the other funny thing is that we and everyone else has kind of settled on the M16 platform, and 5.56 is kind of being the universal satisfactory solution to everything.
For Western countries, at least.
Oh, no, just for home defense, for what you have in your house. You could go 9mm, you could go 308 or 30-06, but everyone kind of compromises on 5.56. We should save this for another time. There was one other a Gemini 3 incident that must be discussed, which is the corned beef sandwich incident. Wally Schirra, funny guy, bit of a troublemaker, famous for that, among other things, one of the Mercury 7. When the food that they were going to eat on Gemini 3 was very unpalatable. It was the first time solid food, I think it was the first time solid food was going to be eaten in space. No, that's not right. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that Wally Schirra stuck a corned beef sandwich into John Young's pocket. And during the flight, John Young pulled it out and offered Gus a bite, and they both each took one bite of the sandwich before putting it away. And it was just a little joke, harmless. But then when they got back, there were like congressional hearings about the out-of-control astronauts bringing unapproved food into space, and what if the crumbs had clogged a circuit or something. It was blown hugely out of proportion.
Why would Congress think that they were more expert in this than the men who were actually flying the mission?
And Deke Slayton said that he had approved it in advance. I frankly don't think that's true. Deke was constantly covering for the slight misbehavior of astronauts in that way. It may have been true. The point is, it didn't really matter, but that was always remembered fondly by everyone involved.
It reminds us that Congress often has nothing better to do than investigate things they don't understand. Not that we wish to get political, but in any event, that is Gemini 3. So now we're...
the important thing to remember about Gemini 3, the first time a spacecraft was actually piloted in space, in the truest sense of the word.
All right, so that's your third greatest space mission of all time. Second greatest, I would agree with this assignment of Apollo 8, which was the first time we orbited the moon. The second greatest of all space
I don't think
missions.
anyone would dispute the last two entries on this list, number 2 and number 1.
And so this is the mission that produced the photographs of the Earthrise over the moon, and also the famous incident where as they were orbiting on, was it Christmas Eve?
It was. I think it was Christmas Day. And Christmas Day, 1968.
And who was reading from the Bible?
All three men. So they wanted to celebrate somehow this remarkable moment in the history of man in a universal way. That was their intention, and so they decided they would read the first 10 verses from Genesis. And
apparently, so the men split it up, and each of them took a few verses from the King James Bible. That is a wonderful juxtaposition. I think a deep moment. That is a deep spiritual moment in the American psyche, and we think of these things as belonging to a completely different time. That is a time when America had this deeper spiritual element that it was not ashamed of invoking. And because this is preserved on tape and you can hear it happening, I think it's worth listening to this part of
Yes, it's one of my favorite recordings. I like to listen to it on Christmas. It's
the story of creation as read from the moon, that is from orbiting the moon, and I take it this was their own idea.
It was their own idea. I believe they discussed it with Deke. And I think Mike Collins, but Mike Collins was going to be on Apollo 8, so I think he mentioned in his book that they discussed it with him too. But it was their idea. They printed it out. They had the laminated sheets ready with these verses, and they were sued when they got back by an atheist group. By the same people who would eventually, let's not go into that. But the point is they were sued, but it was a hugely important moment culturally. And
I don't imagine that the lawsuit garnered very much public support because, generally speaking, it was a huge hit.
Grossly unpopular, the lawsuit.
Yes, because Apollo 8 was a huge hit, and the fact that they read from the Bible was a huge hit. And it seemed to America and sort of Old Testament Christianity, which is what Robert Frost called it, are deeply intertwined. And so that came out at this point. And America saw it, and it was good in America's eyes. So
very well put. America had been going through a very rough time in '68. The war in Vietnam was causing protests on campuses all over the country. There was a lot of racial strife. I think '68 was the year that Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. It was a very difficult time for the country.
Yeah, it was also the end of the C-2 Corvette, which was the best one.
Well, no, but I just mean it was just for people going through their daily lives.
Yeah, but I think that was traumatizing too. The C-2 was such a great design when they switched to the C-3 Corvette.
Scales.
But in any event, yes.
But Mike Collins, who is the Capcom for the capsule communicator astronaut, talking to Gemini 8 for part of the mission, he read them a telegram that they received at Houston from a lady named Mrs. Pringle, I believe, and it just said, "Thank you, you saved 1968." which I just thought was quite moving. I've always really liked that
Yes,
because it was a
it
difficult
was,
year for everyone,
and it was a real win for America. Not just for
and for the
America, but
world. And I don't
well,
want to get all earnest and heartrending about this, but it was a big moment for mankind in general, and in a way, very uniting.
yes, that's a good point. And we always chose to frame this as a giant leap for mankind versus America kind. So,
Yeah,
and
I mean, when Mike Collins designed the Apollo 11 patch, he and the other astronauts, in what I think may have been a gesture that was not really necessary, decided not to put any writing on it in English or any other language, so that they would have a universal feel because they were going for all mankind. That was the idea.
I think that's
I
a
would think,
particularly generous. I mean, also, we couldn't, we didn't yet have the position of knowing that we would be victorious. Although I think that it was a fairly foregone conclusion by that point. Nonetheless, generosity of spirit, generosity in victory, is just as
well,
valuable.
to point out that it was not at all a foregone conclusion, and this is something that I didn't know until very recently. The Soviets were flying a lunar mission at the same time as Apollo 11. It was a robotic lander that crashed, and so it was suppressed, and that's probably why I never heard of it until
Crashed
just the other
where?
day.
Into the Earth or the Moon?
Into the moon. Nowhere near the landing site, but I wonder if NASA
That's
even knew
interesting.
about
I
it at
didn't
the
know that
time. But
they'd been able to get anything remotely close to the Moon.
oh no, they orbited fruit flies and turtles around the moon. I think the first free return trajectory flight around the moon by any vehicle, it was unmanned, was a Soviet flight. I think it was Zond 3. I like the name Zond.
Worth going into
Oh,
then.
one other thing I forgot to mention about Apollo 10, I just did briefly. Apollo 10 still holds the record for the fastest any human being has ever traveled in history. I think it was 24,900 and something miles an hour on reentry.
And what accounted for the difference, which I assume was fairly slight between that and other Apollo missions?
They were testing a slightly steeper trajectory for reentry.
And so this was during the reentry.
Yeah, that's when they hit peak velocity.
All right, so that
but back to Apollo 8. Since we're talking about patches, I'll just mention Apollo 8 has the best patch for anything ever because it was the first lunar flight, and it's a figure 8 around the Earth and the Moon. You know, inside the lower part of the 8 is the Earth, and the top is the Moon. It was designed by Jim Lovell in the back seat of a jet. He just sketched it on his way to Cape Kennedy. I love Jim Lovell. He was great. Everyone loves Jim Lovell. But anyway, so Apollo 8 was the first orbital flight. We discussed a little last time how it was going to be Apollo 9. The LEM wasn't ready, so Apollo 8 got bumped up. There was no backup engine because they didn't bring the LEM with them, so the only engine they had that was strong enough to get them out of lunar orbit was the command module engine. That was so a single engine,
command service
no backup.
module. Yeah, the command service module engine.
Right, the service module engine. Right, yeah. And the reason Artemis 2 didn't enter lunar orbit, I assume, is because for the same reason, because they didn't have a backup engine that was strong enough to get them out if the primary engine failed. Which just shows the lack of confidence in the Orion capsule versus the confidence in the Apollo capsule. Which is, it's prudent in a way, but also a little sad that should be the state of affairs so many years after Apollo 8. And we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of Apollo 8.
Incidentally,
right?
we're dealing with
60th anniversary.
there was a relatively recent failure of the Glenn rocket. Do you want to talk about that briefly? Because
New Glenn is about New Glenn is the New Origin. It's the Blue Origin rocket, which is a competitor to SpaceX. It's Jeff Bezos's company instead of Elon Musk's company. Elon Musk's company, SpaceX, obviously. It's about 5 or 10 years behind SpaceX. So New Glenn is about as powerful as the Falcon Heavy rocket. The Falcon Heavy uses external boosters, though, and New Glenn doesn't. And after New Glenn blew up, a lot of people were complaining, but mentioning to me, it's like, oh, the SLS didn't blow up. New Glenn blew up, ha ha. And it's like, well, yeah, the SLS is 60-year-old technology with virtually nothing new on it. And I'm very glad it didn't blow up. It did its job, the job that it had to do very well. It's just extremely inefficient. It's unbelievably expensive and totally non-reusable. Whereas New Glenn is a much less powerful rocket trying to do something completely different, which is be reusable, and that is clearly the future of spaceflight. So, if you had to choose one of the two to invest in, it's New Glenn, because that's the future of spaceflight is completely.
There's New Glenn versus the SLS or government programs. We don't have an opportunity of not investing in.
Well, yeah, but if the Saturn V had been reusable, we wouldn't have stopped with Apollo 17.
But what's your view on SpaceX versus Blue Origin? As you say, Blue Origin is some years behind.
Yeah,
but...
it's not really a fair comparison because for a couple of reasons. One, they're further behind, even though they successfully reused a rocket before SpaceX did. They have a different approach. SpaceX just wants to fly all the time. They want to test everything in flight, and things blow up, and they just accept that and take it in their stride. Blue Origin wants to figure out everything on the ground, sort of like the Apollo program. They want to figure out everything in simulation, then have it go perfectly, which is why this explosion was a much bigger setback for them than it would have been for SpaceX. But still, they're doing very interesting things. I'm glad that there are two companies working on full reusability instead of just one, because the competition will make them both better, as it always does. I mean, just like our competition with the Soviets is what got us to the moon by the end of the 70s. It's ironic, the competition with communism.
Or the end of the 60s.
By the end of the 60s, right. And then, once we started working with the Soviets, which we did on the space
everything went to hell immediately.
we had nothing to prove anymore. And the reason Artemis is going back to the moon is really just because of our competition with the Chinese space program. So
there's really competition just keeps you sharp. What can we say? The only reason either of us is learning Japanese is because the other one of us is. Otherwise, I doubt we would be attempting something that's so time consuming. But
I discovered something interesting the other day. We were talking about English earlier. English is full of loan words. You know that the word skosh, it's not just a coincidence that it's the same in English and Japanese. It's actually a Japanese loan word.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know we had any words from Japanese.
No, neither did I. But like rock, paper, scissors, shoot, it was brought back to the United States after the Second World War.
All right. I love etymology.
So
but rather than getting into that, we
we still really haven't talked much about Apollo 8. They did, I think, 10 orbits of the moon. I think it was Frank Borman, the commander, who insisted they go into orbit. Frank Borman didn't get to have as much fun as the other guys on the mission because he was responsible for everything. The pressures were enormous. He was constantly making them go to sleep and, stop hanging out at the windows photographing anything. They were like kids on Christmas. I mean, they were literally kids on Christmas morning, seeing all this stuff for the first time. The first men
Who wouldn't be?
Yeah, well, exactly. Who wouldn't be? First men ever to see the moon up close. Everything was brand new. Bill Anders took the famous moonrise photograph. I think Jim Lovell was at the window and suddenly saw the moon rising above the horizon as they orbited the moon. And Bill Anders grabbed his camera. And Bill Anders refused to go to sleep until Frank Borman allowed him to set up an automatic camera system to just keep snapping photos through the window while they slept.
Great idea.
Frank Borman got horrendously sick on the flight to the moon. About a third of astronauts get this. It's I think it's called space adjustment sickness. Just it messes with your inner ears being weightless for an extended period of time. And
so he didn't have a virus or anything. He just got physically sick.
Yeah, he just got physically sick. He got motion sick. The same thing happened to Rusty Schweickart on Apollo 9 and to a bunch of other astronauts. But this is the first time it had happened because this is the first time that anyone had been. The Apollo capsule was the first time astronauts had been able to move around in a capsule in space. In Gemini and Mercury, they were just fixed in a seat. But in Apollo, you could sort of float around. And so it just happened that none of the guys on Apollo 7 were affected by this inner ear problem. But Frank Borman was, and he was horrendously sick, vomiting and so forth.
Did he adjust to that?
He did eventually, but it took like 3 days of hell.
And did he fly in space again?
No, that was his last mission, but that wasn't why. He had already announced his intention to retire and then refused to revoke it when Deke offered to let him be the first man to walk on the moon.
Well, perhaps the inner ear issue had something to do with it then.
Maybe. I wonder. I mean,
no one likes being nauseous,
no,
even if you get to walk on the moon.
It's the worst thing in the world. Someone told me once, it's like you can't die from being motion sick. And that's true, but it's someone
sometimes you wish you could.
Yeah, I mean, I don't get air sick and I don't get seasick, but I do get car sick when I'm not driving. And sometimes I've just wanted to put myself out of my misery. Are you allowed to say that on a podcast?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh yeah, so Frank Borman didn't want anyone to know that, so they put it in the tape dump, and they seriously considered turning the mission around, but he basically refused, and they just ended it there.
In
And so they went and listened to it and then talked to the doctors. Deke, because it was Christmas, Deke had snuck in 3 small bottles of brandy for them to celebrate Christmas with. Frank Borman refused to let them drink them, obviously, because he was a very serious-minded man. They did a lot of navigational testing. Jim Lovell was an incredible navigator and did by hand corrections of their course on the way back to test to see if they were possible. And also because there was some debris flaking that it came off some of the Mylar coverings that was making it hard to see the stars and get readings from them. But interestingly, he ended up doing the exact same manual course correction on Apollo 13 using the LEM instead of the command module. But he had practiced this on Apollo 8, which is one of the reasons he was able to do it successfully on Apollo 13. But basically, aside from Frank Borman getting sick, Apollo 8 was an absolute triumph, unbelievably dangerous, boldly going where no men had gone before. And if it weren't for Apollo 11, it might be the single greatest moment in American history. I mean, you could argue.
So let's move to Apollo 11 then. Our undisputed choice for greatest moon mission of all time. Well, greatest space mission of all time, in as much as it was the first time men had walked on the moon. And
the first time men had ever stepped on anything that wasn't planet Earth. And what a moment. Something that men had dreamed about since the dawn of man. I mean, probably monkeys dreamed about it.
The first thing I have to ask about is that it is alleged that Buzz Aldrin was more peeved about being the second man on the moon than he was happy about being the second man on the moon. That is, he was so upset about not beating Neil out of the door. Obviously, the order at which they were to get onto the moon had been fixed in advance, but nonetheless.
I think that's a little unfair to Buzz. It's partly because on all the Gemini missions, it was always...
Didn't he almost crash the mission, though?
Yeah, we'll get to that. But on the Gemini missions, the commander always stayed inside, and it was the pilot who went out. And so he had assumed that that's how it would work on Apollo 2 for the LEM landings. And in the event, the reason they went with Neil was actually just because of the way the door opened. The LEM door opened inward, and since Buzz was standing on the right and Neil was standing on the left and the door hinges were on the right, it would have been impossible for them to shuffle around and get Buzz out first.
But I assume that the placement of the door hinges had been more or less a coincidence of design, so easily it could have been the other way around.
It could have been the other way around. And I don't think Buzz was nearly as bitter as he's sort of portrayed in the media. He had some problems with alcoholism later in his life and sort of leaned into the bitterness after he got sober again. In sort of an apologetic way. But I think it's a little harsh on Buzz, who is a very good pilot. And but he did almost mess up Apollo 11 because for some reason, though they had never done this in any of the rehearsals, either on Apollo 10 or in the simulators, he thought that in case they had to abort, it would be good to have the ascent radar on already. And so he turned on the ascent radar, and that basically clogged the bandwidth of data being sent back to Houston and caused errors to pop up on the LEM's dashboard and caused them to lose telemetry data in Houston. And this was a huge mistake, and it took them a while to figure out what was causing it. And that Buzz had just decided to, because the ascent radar and the descent radar were 2 different systems.
And is this why they were almost out of fuel by the time they actually landed?
Yeah, so they had like 8 seconds of fuel left when they finally landed. No, less than that. Maybe 0.8 seconds. I should really check. But the other reason is that they had gone a little far. While they'd been trying to figure out what was wrong with the radar system, they had overshot their original landing site. So Neil took over and manually flew them over a big field of boulders and a huge crater to find a flat place where they could land. And they would have had to abort if he hadn't found something. But he did just in the nick of time and set them down with... Let me just look up how much fuel they had left.
That's what you call a real stick and rudder man, being able to land on a new heavenly body without any prior experience.
Well, Neil was, if you look at the data, Neil was the best pilot. He was the only astronaut who had been an X-15 pilot. Well, I
see a greater amount of fuel than is suggested. 0.8 would have been cutting it a little bit close. It seems there were some tenths of seconds of fuel left, which is still
it says it was a premature low warning light. So, well, they didn't know it was premature. We may know now that it was premature, but it was the closest any of the Apollo missions came to a landing, except for Apollo 14, which almost aborted accidentally when a piece of solder got stuck behind the abort switch. That's a story for another time.
How long after they had touched down on the moon? How long did they stay in the capsule before they opened the door and popped out?
Well, originally the plan was going to be for like 8 hours because they wanted the astronauts to sleep first. But
How could you
yeah,
possibly sleep when you
Neil
just landed on
said
the moon?
once they were there, Neil said, "Look, it's the idea of us sleeping now is hopeless. It's not going to happen." So there was a couple hours where they got ready, they got on their suits. Buzz took communion. He self-administered communion, which he did not tell anyone except I think Deke and Neil and a few other people, but they suppressed it because of the lawsuit resulting from Apollo 8. That there couldn't be any more religion involved in the Apollo mission, so he secretly gave himself communion, and then they went outside, and it was only one EVA. It was a reasonably short EVA. All of the pictures are of Buzz because Neil thought people will really want to see men walking on the moon, and Buzz thought, well, we're here to do geology, so I'm just going to take photos of rocks. Which was just, it really demonstrates the difference in their personalities. It's funny that they were not friends. And I don't mean that in like they didn't get along way, or they got along badly. Mike Collins says in his books that of all the Apollo teams, all the Apollo crews, they were the least close. And it was like flying to the moon with two amiable strangers.
So it's not that they disliked each other, but just that there's not the sort of personalities who would choose to spend time with one another at the bar after work.
Right, yeah,
or something like that.
they didn't have a lot of common interests. Both Neil and Buzz were extremely reserved.
But why did they end up on the same crew then? You would think that NASA would try to put crews together that had a more congenial relationship.
Yeah, and like the guys on Apollo 12, they all got matching gold Corvettes, and they were inseparable. And to this day, well, I mean, Pete Conrad died.
C3 Corvettes, by the way, highly defective by comparison with the C2.
Corvettes, I like the Coke bottles.
I'm sorry, it's a great car, but compared to the original Stingray, it's somewhat of a letdown. Anyways, that's aside.
Yeah, most of the Apollo crews were very tight. The Apollo 11 crew was not tight, but it was chosen because they were really, really good at their jobs, and that was much more important than their being good friends. So yeah, they didn't socialize outside of the mission, and sort of lost touch after Apollo 11, which seems strange since there were so few people who could identify.
What was Mike Collins' personality?
Mike Collins was much more gregarious than the other two. So he was sort of the odd man out because he was always up for a good time, and Neil was always up for a good book, and Buzz was always up for a good doctoral dissertation.
It's something that's always made me curious. The fact that they were quarantined in a special airstream or whatever it was when they got back to the Earth. Was there really a suspicion that they might come back with some sort of bizarre moon disease, or was it
yes, there absolutely, and there was no reason at all why that shouldn't have been a realistic fear. We had no idea what the real conditions of the potential for life were on the moon. I mean, we knew there weren't elephants walking around up there, but there could have been microbial life on asteroids that had hit the moon. Things can survive in vacuums. We know that, like tardigrades and bacteria.
But with no water?
With no water, yeah. And the example was Europeans coming to the New World and accidentally giving diseases that they had immunity to people who had no immunity to them, not because they were serious diseases, just because they had no experience with these particular pathogens. And so quarantining them was a prudent thing to do. And, it's easy for us to say now, well, the idea of there being life on the moon was silly and it was a waste of time, but it was better safe than sorry. When you look at how many North Americans were killed after Columbus's crew landed just because diseases to which they had no immunity spread like crazy.
Well, that's fair enough, I suppose. So how long was the EVA, the first EVA on the moon?
2 hours, 31 minutes, and 40 seconds.
All right, well, so that's not bad.
1 hour order of magnitude off.
That's not a bad amount of time to spend on the moon. I mean, it's a long time to get there, but I would certainly enjoy 2 hours on the moon, or 20 minutes for that matter.
It also says that it happened 2.5 hours after landing.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Enough time to suit up and prepare.
Apparently, there's a moment in the footage where Neil is off screen. He spotted some interesting samples at the edge of a crater and just sort of lay down on the moon and shove them all into a sample box. And that's where it's generally regarded the best Apollo 11 and some of the best overall Apollo lunar rock samples came from. Neil was a very keen geologist. Pardon my
And so, what are the lunar rocks made of?
they're made of moon. Uh,
Iron.
no, there's very little iron in them. Basically, it's the same as the Earth's crust, but with severe iron deficiency and a somewhat different elemental composition on a in a more general level. But basically the material is similar to the Earth's crust because basically the moon and the Earth were made out of the same stuff. They were originally, it's believed, one
All right. So
celestial
then,
body.
why does the moon end up with so much less iron?
That is a mystery. I wrote a paper on it years ago. I think there was a more iron-dense moon that was in a further out orbit that eventually separated from the Earth-Moon system, taking spare angular momentum and a lot of iron with it.
An interesting theory.
Yeah.
So we've covered Apollo 11 now, the greatest mission of all time, the greatest space flight of all time, and so I guess the only question that remains is when will we be going back, and who will that be?
Oh, very droll. No, I love the movie Apollo 13 so much, but that very awkward, badly written sentence that it ends on, when will we go back and who will that be, is just so. It's not like it ruins the movie, but it's a little weird.
No, it definitely doesn't. And you know that I mean the movie is a masterpiece. We've already talked about it in our list of greatest movies of all time. It certainly is one thing I was going to mention earlier is that there are not that many movies that are rigorously historically accurate and extraordinarily entertaining. I should say that a movie that did not make your list,
The
but made
longest
my
day.
no, no. Well, that's accurate in a different sort of way, and you know, there are too many different threads of the story going on in The Longest Day. It's too complex a story, too many characters involved. But 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which also is based on a book, if you read the book, you'll find by Lieutenant Lawson, who is the pilot of the B-25 in question, and
Ted
played
Lawson.
by Van Johnson, Ted Lawson. You'll find that it's extraordinary how historically accurate the movie is, even to details that you would have thought would be absolutely incredible and that must have been added just to spruce up
Yeah.
the excitement factor.
Like Madge bringing the sizzle platters to be carried aboard Ted's
Yeah,
B-25s.
someone giving them a box of records to take at the last moment, and them taking off from the aircraft carrier having forgotten to put their
Yeah.
flaps down and almost crashing. I mean, so that's an extraordinarily exciting story, also, and also one of the greater movies around. But we agree that Apollo 13 is one of the greatest of all. A great mission. Although I don't think it made your greatest missions list because after all, it
Well,
had some
it's on
issues as
my
well.
honorable mention.
I think we should save the honorable mentions for another day. But I would briefly point out that if Apollo 13 wasn't one of the greatest space flights, it was certainly one of the greatest demonstrations of what all
Of
of those
courage and
minds.
competence.
Yes, well, not just of the men in the air, well, in the space as it were, but also of the men on the ground. All of those guys working together and coming up with truly original solutions to extremely difficult and literally unprecedented problems, which is worth celebrating. Which is, I suppose, why they made the movie and why it's so good.
Yeah, it's an exceptional movie. I imagine anyone listening to this has seen it, but if you haven't, you should. I think we should also just take a moment to thank the surprisingly large number of people who've been listening and watching our content, which caught me completely off guard. But we've had like a million and a half views in the last 30 days
On our Instagram
on our
reels.
Instagram, right? And we're closing in on 10,000 followers, I think. We've had 67,000 likes, 3,000 comments on that. Anyways, the point is we really appreciate it. We weren't expecting, I think, to get so many people interested in this stuff. So
That's a
you.
good point. So thanks to the people who are listening and the ones who actually came over here to listen to the podcast. More will follow.